Joy Division, New Order, The Smiths, The Stone Roses, The Happy Mondays, and of course Oasis. All made in Manchester, a city that has produced some of the biggest bands in pop music history. It was also the birthplace of this week's guest, Ged Doherty, who worked his way from booking acts at Sheffield Uni into music management and then onto the label side. First in New York, and later back in the UK as chairman of Sony Music. Having conquered the music business, he then switched his creative energy to the film industry, partnering with Colin Firth to establish a film production company, Raindog Films. When he's not producing critically and commercially successful movies, he spends his time as chairman of the BPI, the music industry's trade association that runs the Brit Awards and the Mercury Music Prize. Ged is a lover of storytelling, and he shares many of these fascinating stories on this week's pod. Enjoy. Hi Ged, welcome to the pod.
Hey Danny, how you doing? Thanks for asking me to come on.
Absolute pleasure. I had a guest on recently, John McMahon, who in the early part of his career had played football for his university. In his case, it was American football, and the university was Berkeley. And so he ended up playing football for his university in front of a crowd of about 60,000 people. I played football for my university, which was the University of Manchester, and we ended up being located in a playing field in Wythenshawe. So circumstances were quite different, it's fair to say. But I do know Wythenshawe, therefore, and I did spend a bit of time down there. And I know that it's a tough part of Manchester, but that's where you started out. And yet here you are with two very successful careers, one in music and one in film. How did you go from those early days in Wythenshawe into the music business?
Well, thank you for your kind comments there, Danny. Growing up in Wythenshawe, it was at the time the largest council estate in Europe, and those football fields you played on, I know very well. I used to train there twice at weekends and every Wednesday night because I played for a local team, a school team, and our school team did rather well. And we at 15, we did a tour. We went over to play the Canadian national team, and we weren't a bad team. A couple of our players went on to be professionals. But growing up in Wythenshawe, especially for me, I was one of 9 kids, Irish Catholic family. I have 7 sisters, big music family. My parents were big into music, but Irish music mainly. And the entire family were Manchester United fans, apart from me. I thought I'd be awkward. I was the eldest. I thought I'd go against everybody else as I was figuring out about football. I always liked being the outsider. I always liked being not going with the norm. And I think it started back then, bizarrely, by choosing Manchester City over Manchester United. And to this day, we still have the rivalry between my sisters and my one brother is a big red. But I think having that kind of mentality, especially when you're a City fan and we were losing for 30 odd years, you just kind of become, you don't take anything for granted. I think you become a bit more self-reliant. I think you become a little bit more willing to take risks, because no one takes you seriously anyway, because you're a City fan. And so I remember when I was 15 joining an Irish pipe band as a drummer. Well, actually, I joined us to to learn the bagpipes because I wanted to learn a musical instrument. God knows why I chose the bagpipes. I was terrible. And I thought, actually, maybe I'll try the drums. That seems pretty easy. You just got to hit something. So I became a drummer in the band. And there's a picture of it, me floating around somewhere in my kilt, marching with this Irish band through the streets of Wythenshawe. And it was through drumming. I liked being a drummer. I bought a drum kit, met a friend of mine I'm still very friendly with to this day, who taught me to play the drums, and I joined a local band. But by the time I was 17, I realized I was absolutely useless and would have no chance of, because every kid who gets in a band, wants to think one day they might crack it. I was very fortunate to realize, by the time I was 17, I was useless. Went to college in Sheffield when I was 18, and I loved being in and around music. So I became the social secretary of the college, which is now Sheffield University. It was then Sheffield Polytechnic. And this was just when punk arrived in 1976. No, 1975. I became the college promoter at college there, booked all the bands, booked the Stranglers, the Adverts, the Damned, all these bands that were coming up, and ended up helping a local club, the Sheffield Limit Club, open for their opening night. I booked Susie and the Banshees, And so I sort of became, I managed to marry my love of music with, finding a career in it. I hated my college course, left, went to London. I got offered a few jobs to become a booking agent, chose one company because of the people, loved the people. The acts they had were terrible. There were all these heavy metal bands, Stray, Strife, Strider, Nuts, all these bands no one's ever heard of anymore. But it was there, as I was the junior agent, I was given the task of booking a band called Street Band, who were a pretty awful rock band signed to Logo Records. But the singer of Street Band was a singer called Paul Young, who I remember thinking, God, this guy's amazing. And he was singing these rock things that were pretty horrible, to be honest with you. And apologies to any members of Street Band who might be listening.
We do have a very passionate street band following, actually. So.
Oh, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. You'll be surprised when they turn up, Danny. You'll be regretting saying that. For the B-side of their first single, they used to have a thing. The guitar player, John, was always breaking his strings. So they did this kind of ditty, which was basically the rest of the band just playing along without guitar while the guitar player changed his string and Paul would sing. And it was a song called Toast. And he would rap on this song all about getting up in the morning, making a piece of toast. Anyway, Kenny Everett, who was a DJ at the time on Capitol, flipped the single, started playing Toast. It became a massive hit and completely destroyed their career as a rock band. And so anyway, shortly afterwards, I left the agency, Outlaw Agency, that was booking them. I went to work for another agency, Asgard, that booked Van Morrison and the Undertones and, lots of amazing acts, Loudon Wainwright III. And I remember reading somewhere that Street Band had broken up. And so I contacted Paul and I said, oh, Paul, I've gone into the management world. Oh, I forgot to say an act I had at Asgard was a band called Sniffing the Tears, who had an American manager called Bud Prager, who managed Foreigner, who were the biggest band in the world at the time. And I was the agent for Sniffing the Tears, and they had a number one single called Driver's Seat, and in America, and I think then it became a big hit in the UK. And I managed to persuade him to give me a job, because I hated being an agent. I managed to persuade him to give me a job to open up a management company for him so I could manage Sniffing the Tears and take care of them in Europe, because he rarely left America. Anyway, so he gave me this job. So I rang Paul up. I said, oh, I've gone into the management business. I hear you've got a new band. What's it about? He said, oh, come down and see him. We're playing at I think it was the John Bull in Chiswick, or the Greyhound in Fulham Palace Road. And I went to see them, and it was packed. It was a Tuesday night, freezing cold. There was 400 people packed in there, most of which, I'd say 80% of which were women, all dancing and going crazy to this soul music I'd never heard before. Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett. I'd never heard these songs. And they were a 9-piece band. They were called the Harrow Horns at that point. And I just fell in love with the music and fell in love with what Paul was doing. And so I took him and the guitar player out for a very expensive Greek meal across the road. That didn't take my credit card, so Paul had to pay in his cash that he just earned from the gig. And he said to me, anybody who can get me to buy dinner deserves to be my manager. So I became his manager. I managed him for 13 years and took him from the Greyhound in Fulham Palace Road to Live Aid at Wembley and Madison Square Garden and Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens. And, he was huge all over the world. So that's how I learned about the music business. I learned about people. I think I was 22 at the time, and saw how different markets worked, how different medias work, how the press work in Germany versus Australia versus South America versus the US. And it just became, being a manager is a great way of learning about the business and about people and human beings and the stresses of being on the road and pressures of recording and dealing with record companies and dealing with agents and dealing with publishers. So it was a great sounding, a great jumping off point for me.
And then at some point you moved over to the label side of things. So you were a manager and I guess you had a number of acts, but then the labels came calling.
Yeah, I think I'd pretty much done everything I'd wanted to do in the management world. And by this was 88 by then. And a friend of mine, Richard Griffiths, had gone to work in America and was very successful in America. He too started out as a manager and as an agent. And he then went on to manage One Direction and Little Mix and all these things. And we've been friends for donkey's years. And he'd moved to America. And I remember bringing him up one day and I was like, give us a job. I was in his office. I was doing something in New York. And he went, oh, are you serious? I said, yeah, I've had enough of being a manager. He said, would you move to New York? I said, in a heartbeat. I said, great. But I'll come back to this. We're reorganizing the company here. There might be a job going as head of international marketing. It's a new position that hasn't been created before. I was like, great, count me in. Anyway, he rang me a couple of weeks later. And he said, I'll agree to run it by Tommy Mottola, who's my boss. And for those of you who know Tommy, Tommy's quite a character. And I'd met Tommy in my Paul Young days because he managed Hall & Oates. And a song that Paul did that became #1 in America and most countries around the world, which was a song called Every Time You Go Away, was a Hall & Oates B-side. So I'd met Tommy through that and had quite a good relationship with Tommy. At the time, Tommy had become the chairman of Sony Music Worldwide. And Richard called him and said, I'm thinking of him giving Ged a job. And Tommy was like, that's great. Ged knows where all the bodies are buried. Was his quote. He knows traveling around the world. He knows marketing, knows every different country. And so they gave me the job, and we just signed Pearl Jam, Rage Against the Machine. Ozzy Osbourne was back in business. Gloria Estefan was doing well. Luther Vandross was doing well. Cyndi Lauper was doing well. So I just signed at the right time. A band called Spin Doctors, a band called Living Colour. All these acts were all breaking all over the world. So I spent most of my time, even though I'd moved to New York, traveling around the world with these bands, which again was a great experience. But it was a great experience to learn the business inside of a corporation in a New York headquarters. And it really gave me, hopefully, a global picture, a global view of actually just how big the world is. I know it sounds a bit stupid to say that, but when you're in England, I think sometimes we look at it just from a very English point of view, British point of view. That experience in New York taught me to hopefully think a lot more globally. And it was an incredible experience. And I then came back to run Columbia Records in the UK. I was the managing director of that when we just signed the Fugees, and Mariah Carey was breaking, and then Maxwell and loads of other acts. And then I went to work for BMG, left Sony, went to work for BMG. And my office was 2 doors down from Simon Cowell, became very friendly with Simon. That's when he got involved with Pop Idol and American Idol. And Simon Fuller was an old mate of mine. I'd met Simon Fuller when he was 19 and I was 20. And he was the intern at Chrysalis Music. So I became very friendly. I'd become very friendly then with the 2 Simons, which later on in my career, I became the kind of go-between between the 2 Simons as both of their careers rocketed. But I remember traipsing around New York, me and both Simons trying to get one of the labels, the Sony US labels, to take American Idol seriously and to take the artists that were coming from American Idol seriously, because Americans just saw it as having no credibility. And it was a fad, and they weren't real artists and all these kind of things. So they didn't take it seriously. And I remember going, me and Simon Cowell and Simon Fuller going to Clive Davis's office, begging him to take the artist seriously. And God bless Clive, he did. He got involved, and then suddenly all the American Idol acts started selling records. So again, great experience about the American, recorded music market again. Yeah, and then through various series of changes internally, this was at the time BMG merged with Sony. I became the president of the merged company. A year later, Sony Corp in New York stole Rob Stringer to go to Sony Corp to replace Donny Ienner, who'd left, and he was the chairman of Columbia. Now, of course, Rob runs Sony Music Worldwide. He was Paul Young's product manager originally, so I've known Rob since back then. And when Rob went off to New York, I became the chairman of Sony Music in the UK. And I became Simon Cowell's boss, running all of his businesses. And that was when, X Factor was happening, and all of his acts were happening all over the world. And all of LA Reid's acts were happening, Pink, Usher, TLC. There was all an amazing amount of acts. And Richard Griffiths had signed Cheeky Records for a band called Faithless. Rollo, one of the main guys in Faithless, the producer, his sister was doing backing vocals on the Faithless record. Her name was Dido. She came along when Richard signed Cheeky Records. He knew a little bit about Dido, but nothing about her. But he signed Cheeky Records to get Faithless. Along came Dido as part of the deal, and of course, 2 years later, she'd sold 40 million records. And which is bizarrely the connection of how I got into the film business. I remember having lunch one day with Dido, and she'd been to an Oxfam fundraising dinner and ended up sitting next to Colin Firth at this fundraising dinner. And he persuaded her to go to Ethiopia with him and his wife on an Oxfam fair trade mission, because Colin and Livia were ambassadors for Oxfam at the time. And I happened to see her, had lunch the following day after this dinner, and she was nervous about going because the only images we ever used to have at Ethiopia at that time, starving kids with, those pictures you would see of and I said, I'll go with you, which is what I love to do, because as I the more, when you have those jobs, those corporate jobs, the more you go up the ladder, the less you get to spend time with the creators and the artists, which is always the bits I loved the most. So I had any excuse, I'd go on the road with the artists on tour or wherever they were or whatever they were doing, making an album in the south of France, I'll go. Making an album in Australia, I'll go. And when she's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to Ethiopia, I was like, I go. Always wanted to go to Africa. And it was on that trip, Dido, Colin and I bonded over a love of music. Colin is a massive music fan that not many people know about. And back in the time, you had these iPods that had a game on them called Beat the Intro, where it would play 3 seconds of a song on your iPad and you had to guess what it was. Anyway, Colin would regularly beat me and Dido. Dido was, and to me, to a greater or lesser degree, were much better at more current things. So more current pop music and ours. But Colin has an encyclopedic knowledge of music, particularly blues and American country music and everything from in the 60s and 70s. He can tell you who wrote the B-side, who designed the album sleeve, which I'll come back to later because that's a film we're making at the moment about this company designed all the Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Paul McCartney sleeves. Wing sleeves. Yeah, so that's how I met Colin and bonded with Colin. And then his wife, Livia, was a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. So every time Bruce used to come to London, Bruce was on Columbia, one of our artists, I would take Colin and Livia to the show. And then we'd go back to the Claridge's afterwards to have a drink with Bruce and the band in the bar. So, I became even friendlier with Colin and his wife and the family. And we just bonded over music. So much so when I left Sony I was unceremoniously dumped as the chairman, because I'd become the chairman of the company. And as anybody out there who's done those jobs know, the only thing that's certain about those jobs is one day you'll get fired.
It's a bit like being a Premier League manager.
Exactly like being a Premier League manager. And at the time, even though the Sony territory, the UK I ran was the most successful Sony territory in the world at the time, largely because of the Simon Cowell business that was part of it. My boss who'd hired me to become the chairman of the company, he got fired. And when the new chairman came in from one of our rival companies, I knew I was history and I'd just signed a new 3-year contract. So literally, I think about 8 weeks after I'd signed the contract, I got the call that I was no longer needed, which was great because they had to pay me a lot of money to get rid of me. And I used that money. I was trying to figure out what to do. I took 6 months off. And it was my daughter, who was a budding actress at the time, said to me, Dad, why don't you start a film production company with Colin? And then you can put me in all your films. And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. So it was literally as simple as that. But also it was partly, Simon Cowell wanted me to set up a management company for him, which I didn't want to do. Richard Griffiths, then in that last season of X Factor that I was involved in, we just put together One Direction and various other things. He wanted me to start a US management company. Run the US management arm of his company, Modest Management. Which I thought, no, I don't really want to go back into management. Yeah, maybe Jesse's idea of going into the film business is not a bad idea. I thought I'll try something different. So I rang Colin. I said, I fancy going into the film business. What do you think? He said, you've got to be mad. It's a crazy business. I said, yeah, but if I can handle Simon Cowell and Philip Green, who was Simon Cowell's manager at the time, and I've dealt with Jay-Z's representatives and Beyonce's representatives, I'm sure I can handle people in the film business. He was like, well, and then he said, what do you need me to do? He said, because I'm useless. I hate meetings. I'm unreliable because I'm always doing, I'm always off on jobs doing things. And, I don't have that much time to do things. I said, well, I need you to do 3 things for me. I need you to read scripts and tell me if they're any good, because I'd never read a script in my life at that point. And if they are good and you like them, bring your mates to either be in them or direct them or write them if they need some more work. And the third thing is shake hands and kiss babies. So if we need to raise money, I need you to come occasionally meet a financier or two. And he's like, oh, I can do that. And I said, I'll do everything else. And we set up the company. Originally, we were going to do film, comedy through a friend of mine, Phil McIntyre, who was a big comedy promoter at the time. I was trying to do this film. I just read a book about, what was that company called? SBK, one of those big companies.
DreamWorks SKG.
It's become DreamWorks, and I'd read a book about them and how they put it together. And having just left Sony and still having the ego the size of a house, I thought, I'm going to build this mega company and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, we're going to do comedy, we're going to do music, and we're going to do film. And quite quickly, I realized that I didn't want to do all those things. I just wanted to do the things I wanted to learn something new. So I focused in on film. And I'd always promised Colin we'd do music stuff. And at that time, we didn't do any music very early on, but now we're doing a lot of music-based films as well. So I've managed to keep my promise to him to also do music stuff. So yeah, that's how we started the company, and we couldn't think of a name for the company. We kept sending each of these stupid names to the company, and I just said to him, "What's your favorite album of all time?" He said, "Oh, it's easy. It's Raindogs by Tom Waits." I said, "Great." So we became Raindog, and he always liked the image. Again, as I said, I've always felt like an outsider back from those early days in Wythenshawe, and I was now going into a business where I knew two people, Colin and Nick Angel, who's a very famous music supervisor. I've known him for many, many years. So I knew two people. So again, felt like an outsider. And Colin too, as a producer, we liked the image of, a rain dog, a dog outside in the rain that no one's paying any attention to, that occasionally somebody might let in the house to dry off. So we liked that as a name. And so we became Raindog Films.
Just coming back on the music side, what is the role of the label or the music company, and how did it change over the years? Often the labels or the music companies only hit the headlines when George Michael's suing them or something like that, and the rest of the time they're sort of a bit more in the background. So I think in some ways not everyone knows what a music label does and how it fits into the picture. So it'd be really interesting to get an understanding of that.
Yeah, great question. Music companies, we talk about recording companies, it's essentially recording companies, music publishing companies. They're the companies who publish the written songs, if you like, the copyright. Management companies, live companies, live promoters. But I worked for the recorded music companies, and essentially the recorded music companies are the first investors, and they have teams of people called A&R teams. They're called artists and repertoire. So an old term from the 50s. And it's their job to go out and find artists, and it goes in and out of vogue whether artists should write their own songs or not. And sometimes record companies will only sign artists that write their own songs. And when I was managing Paul Young for the time, at the beginning, he didn't write any of his own songs, which was very unfashionable, which is why we ended up doing a lot of cover songs. But the labels are the first people who invest in the artist, and they put the initial time, effort, and money in. There was always a well-known statistic that 9 out of 10 acts are financially not successful for the companies. So it's a high-risk business. So for that one artist that does make it, they've got to pay for the mistakes of everybody else that doesn't get signed. So I remember this was, I guess, in the early 2000s, I guess, when first Apple appeared and the iPod appeared, and shortly after Napster and all these things where music was trading for free. Everybody was trying to set up a record company because they thought, it's easy. So you had magazines setting up their own labels, you had radio stations setting up their own labels, even TV companies going, it's easy. Anybody can do this. Well, none of them ever had any success because it's not as easy as it looks. You need specialists who live, sleep, breathe, and eat music and understand artist development, understand song structure, understand what makes a hit. And guess what? 2021 record companies are still doing exactly what they've always done, which is find artists, develop them, put the right producer with them, get the right material, then market them in the correct sense, but also understanding artists. I was very fortunate I would never claim to have been an artist because I was a drummer. So our drummers, artists, when that's the eternal debate. But at least being on the road, I understood the pressures of going on the road, then being a manager and seeing a successful act and then seeing what happens. So I've always kind of been that kind of in-between person between when I worked for a label, between the company, the corporate side of the business, and the creative side of the business. The companies felt comfortable talking to me about the art because they knew I'd been a manager, and the artists felt comfortable talking to me about issues they had about the corporation because they knew I'd once been on their side. So I managed to do that. But essentially, that's what record companies do, is sign, find, develop, and finance unknown artists. And of course, if you're a UK company and you're working at somebody like Sony, you will also distribute and market their American acts like Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and Beyonce, Usher, TLC, whoever it might be we worked with.
And were there tensions or frictions or difference of opinions over what acts might work? If you sign to Sony in the UK, is there an expectation that you'll sign for Sony in the US and vice versa? And do people have different perspectives? Do executives have different perspectives over whether they want artists from somewhere else? Is that one of the tension points in that business?
Yes, is the simple answer to that. There's, we'd sign an act in the UK and we'd think, oh, this act's brilliant. They're going to be huge. We love them, blah, blah, blah. And contractually, the smarter lawyers and the smarter acts would have contractual release commitments. If you're a UK act, you must release their album in, America, Germany, Australia, Japan, and somewhere else to fulfill the contractual commitment. And if you didn't release it in those 5 territories, the contract wasn't deemed fulfilled, and they could get the rights back in those territories. So there was always arguments and discussions about that. But many, 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 many times, I'll give you one example. I was involved with the signing of Calvin Harris. We signed Calvin when he was still stacking shelves in Dumfries. I can't remember if it was at Tesco or Asda, I can't remember. I'll find out for you, Danny. And Craig Logan, who worked for me at the time, who was the 3rd member of Bros. You might remember Craig from when he was the bass player in Bros. He was
that guy.
I brought him in. He was the managing director of RCA Records. And another guy called Mike Pickering, who used to be an M People, also worked
DJ, for me. Manchester DJ.
Another Manchester DJ, exactly. And after M People had run its course, I said to Mike, Mike was a fantastic DJ and had already signed a load of records, a load of artists for Deconstruction, a very famous dance label that he was part of the A&R team for. I said, come and work for us. We need to build up this side of the company. I remember me and Craig Logan, we were driving the car one day. He said, oh, Mike's come across this guy called Calvin Harris from Scotland. Here's a demo. We're in the car, we play in the demo. I pulled the car over. I said, this is fantastic. Let's call Mike. And I said, Mike, sign him now. This is brilliant. And it was a demo, I think, for a song called Acceptable in the 80s, which became one of his hits. Anyway, we signed Calvin. Our American company, for example, and a lot of our companies around the world passed on Calvin. When we sent them the stuff, they were like, this kind of music, what do you call it? Electronic dance music? No, that doesn't happen in America. That'll never happen in America. And so Calvin's first records didn't come out on Columbia in America. They came out through an independent label. So again, when we put One Direction together, all the labels around the world were like, no, boy bands are over. They don't sell records anymore. Nobody wants a boy band. And we were like, well, we think so. So I remember Sonny Takar, who was the head of Simon Cowell's company at the time, wonderful executive, great marketing executive. He's like, well, let's forget all the Sony labels. Let's go and break them ourselves on the internet. And so we got our Swedish company on board a lot of the big Swedish pop writers and producers were coming out of Sweden at the time. So they saw the potential for One Direction. So it was the Swedish company in conjunction with Sonny and his team at Syco, the marketing guys. Syco is Simon Cowell's company. We broke them out of Sweden, and we broke them on the internet, and we broke them through videos and had nothing to do with radio. And I've seen that time and time again in my career. I remember sitting with our Italian company going, oh yeah, Beyonce will never sell in Italy. They don't play American music like that in Italy. The ridiculous conversations or the ridiculous quotes that people would say to you that 5 years later, they were more than likely not in the company any longer for those kind of statements. So there's loads of those. So yes, there's lots of tension all the time.
Our lives, and specifically your career in the music business, spanned a period of a massive change in technology. We went from the mixtape to the playlist, and there was, of course, the big rise and boom of CDs, and then that started to dissipate. How exciting was it when CDs started to take off? And then what was the reaction when it became clear that through changes in technology and streaming and piracy, that the boom was going to come to an end?
Well, technology and the music industry have always gone hand in hand since the invention of the microphone, the invention of the gramophone, radio, and there's been the death of the music industry has been prescribed many, many times with this change in technology every time. But of course, what it's done every single time, as we've seen in film and television, all it's done is increase the awareness, increase the accessibility to the consumer of this. So when CDs came along, absolutely. I remember going to my first meeting because we were used to like 12-inch sleeves and, picture your sleeves, that big so you could see them. A first meeting where we went, so yeah, we've got this newfangled thing. It's only about this big. And that the artwork was getting shrunk down to that. And everybody was up in arms that the artwork was so small, you couldn't read the lyrics. But of course, the consumer loved CD and it took off like a rocket. And I'll never forget 1983 when Thriller going into CBS one day because the Paul Young album was about to come out. And they just, I think They got an order for 1,000,000 Michael Jackson Thriller albums in one day or something, all on CD. And that's when it really exploded. And as I say, consumers liked it because you couldn't break it, and the sound was great. And so that really, that gave the music industry at that time a huge injection of life. Of course, then there's been subsequent technology changes with, of course, digital music coming along, Napster. I remember I worked at BMG when BMG bought Napster originally. But they were like, there's 80 million people here who love music, trading music. Let's have a dialogue with them. And they tried to start the first iTunes, if you like. But of course, the rest of the music business clubbed together and shut them down, sued them, which was a big mistake, as historically has been proven since. But obviously, it was clear that digital music was the future. It was just how did you recapture the genie after it had been left out of the bottle, because digital files could be transferred for free. So the music industry has done a phenomenal job of recovering from those days in the early 2000s to where it is again now. The music industry, if you like, was the canary in the coal mine for digital media because of the size of the file. 3-minute song takes up nothing on a digital file. And so it went through some incredibly hard times, incredibly difficult times, had to reinvent itself. I always used to say to people when I ran Sony, we have to justify our place at the table anymore. You've got the fan on one side, you've got the artist on the other side. We're the people in the middle. We have to justify why either of them should deal with us. Every day of the week, we have to justify our seat at the table. I thought we became very good at innovating ideas and trying different things. We made tons of mistakes. Some of the things we managed to get right. But it was a very, very scary time because, by about 2008, sales around the world was falling off a cliff. But music consumption was never bigger. So the challenge was to try and marry the two, which, as I say, streaming has become that. 85%, I think, of the music now consumed in the UK is streaming.
You touched on X Factor and Idol and Simon Cowell earlier. At some point, Simon or somebody else in the team pitched X Factor. And did you say immediately, yeah, let's do that now?
Simon had been working on an idea for X Factor for quite some time. I have to be careful what I say legally here, because there was a lot of disputes between Simon Fuller and Simon Cowell, which were eventually all sorted out. But yes, as with all of these shows, ever since Opportunity Knocks and what was that other talent show?
New Faces. There's always been a spate of their new shows, and then 10 years later there'll be another version, but slightly different. But it was incredibly exciting being involved in Idol, an American Idol, which just was the biggest show ever on American television, and I think today still has been. And then Simon came up with the X Factor format, and everybody bit his hands off for it. And so it was often at those times, it was literally just trying to grab on and hold on, because it was like a rocket taking off the whole time. So you'd just be marshalling everybody together just to try and support, because these things would happen incredibly quickly. And one of the things I always loved about Simon, he's like totally committed. When he's committed to something, boom, you just go and you hang on and try and marshal the troops all together to support him and his team the best way possible. Could you see that sort of drive and personality becoming a TV personality and the kind of persona that he's become subsequently when you knew him just as a music guy?
How you see Simon on television is exactly how he is. He's got a fantastic sense of humor. He's so intuitive about music. He's a gigantic music fan, which a lot of people, again, don't give him credit for. He listens to everything. He loves film and television. He's very culturally aware, and he lives, breathes, sleeps, and eats it. Yeah, he enjoyed working with him tremendously. Learned a lot from him as well, and we had a lot of fun doing it, because he doesn't take anything seriously, but he takes it incredibly seriously at the same time. And it was an incredible experience.
How important did X Factor become to the Sony Music UK business?
Incredibly important. At one point in time, not just Sony Music UK, but Sony globally. I once worked out, I think that the Simon Cowell business was responsible for about 1 year for about 30% of the global profits of Sony Music, just the Simon Cowell business, which was all part of the business I ran. So the UK company was a big provider of talent from those shows. And, at the time we had Dido, we'd signed Kasabian, we'd signed Calvin. There was a lot of new stuff coming through as well, apart from just the X Factor X.
So you mentioned earlier about setting up Raindog and moving into film. How did you accomplish it, though? I mean, it's not a straightforward thing to move from an audio medium to a visual medium, and a completely new industry. As you said, you need two people. What kind of skills and knowledge did you bring from music, do you think, that helped on film, and how did you start to build a presence?
I think if I'd have known then what I know now about the business, I would not have gone into it. I came to the business completely ignorant, completely stupid, and completely naive. As I said before, that going to the film business, that seems easy. And what I will say, and this might be very controversial, and some people listening, if they had been thinking about ringing me up and doing some business with me one day after I'm about to say what I'm saying, will never ring me. Because people often ask me what's the difference I've found between the music business and the film business so far. And I say to them, well, so far, my experience of the independent film business in the UK, this film business in the UK makes the music business look like it's run by honest, reliable, organized people. The music industry has a very unfair and unjustified reputation, normally perpetuated by disgruntled people who haven't been successful. But the film business, God, if I had £10 for everybody who's wanted to finance one of our films, we'd be doing this pod from my private yacht off Antigua. But in answer to your question about, I say that slightly tongue in cheek, though, Danny, because to me, the film business, music's a 3-minute story. A song is a 3-minute story. A film is a 90-minute story. Television, a series of 60-minute stories or whatever. So it's stories. I've always loved storytelling, and I've always loved things that I think people would like to hear about or know about. I've always been moved by stories, either in the 3-minute form of a song or in a script, incredible script. And so the skills, if anything, as I say, is largely funded by ignorance. As I say, Colin and I joke about this all the time. I used some of my severance money from Sony. I thought, right, we're going to set up this film company. We probably need X to get the company running. I'd mentally written off some money that Sony had given me for my severance. I thought, right, I'll invest this. So like going to university, I'm investing it in myself. So I'm happy to spend that money because I'm learning. I always love to learn every week. So I set aside a certain amount of money. And the first thing I put my money into was this story that Colin told me about this couple who were married in Virginia in 1958, the year I was born. They were married the week I was born in 1958. Called Richard and Mildred Loving. And he told me this story that he'd been approached to originally to write and direct, but he decided he didn't want to do it. And I just thought it was one of the most beautiful stories I'd ever heard. I thought it was one of the most important American civil rights stories I'd ever heard. And I couldn't understand why I'd never heard about it. So through various people, including meeting Martin Scorsese along the way, who helped us guide us to a writer-director, Jeff Nichols, I paid to hire Jeff Nichols to write the script for Loving. I would never do that now. I did it out of complete ignorance, no clue. Again, at the time, I hadn't read that many scripts. I was thinking, this film business is easy. I think Jeff's a great writer, director. It'll be fantastic to get Jeff to write the script. And, it's that act of naivety. And that's why Colin and I joke about it all the time. And again, that was a big learning for us, because even though Jeff was going to write the script for us at the time, he wasn't guaranteed that he would direct it. When the script came in, it was 90 pages long, which is very short for a feature film. Very little dialogue. And we had a couple of financiers look at it and they were like, well, nothing happens. And we were like, yeah, but we love it. If you know Jeff's work, you know there's going to be something special here. So anyway, it was a huge learning curve for me into the film business, to believe in the creative process and believe in the creativity of someone like Jeff Nichols based on the things that he'd done. And then, we found a financiers, Big Beach, who loved it as much as we did. They financed the film. Then we found Focus Features, who bought the film and loved it as much as we did. And then it went on to get nominated for an Oscar for Ruth Negga. So that naivety led to something incredible. But I wouldn't do it again with my own money.
You had a movie before that, Eye in the Sky, that was released. And if you think about the first album that you were involved in and that first movie that was released, what was the tougher one to put together?
Oh, easily the first film. The first album I was involved in putting together was Paul Young's debut album, which sold God knows how many million copies, millions of singles. that was made for 75 grand on dead studio time in Manfred Mann's studio in the Old Kent Road. You know, again, naivety, you know, we were young, but, you know, great songs. And so that was a dream to put together. After I'd left Sony, Martin Mills, who runs a company called Beggars Banquet, it's the largest independent record company in the world, invited me to his party. And people from major labels never used to get invited to his party. But after I'd left Sony, he invited me to a party. But he just signed Adele and all these incredible other acts. Oh, he hadn't signed, the guys who worked for him. I signed anyway. At the party, I ran into an old friend of mine I hadn't seen. He said, "Oh, what are you doing now?" I said, "Oh, I've got into the film business, you know, all kind of." And he said, "Oh, you should meet my friend here, Guy Hibbert. He's a screenwriter. He's a BAFTA-winning screenwriter." And so he took me over to meet him. I met Guy, and Guy told me about the idea for Eye in the Sky. I said, "That sounds fantastic. I'd love to read it." He sent it to me. I read it that night. I said, "I love it." I'd read 6 scripts, I think, by that time. Luckily, Colin read it and went, "Yeah, it's really good." But there was a director involved at the time, then, so we passed on getting involved that we didn't think would make the film correctly. So anyway, about a year later, President Obama announced that, or admitted that the US had killed civilians in drone strikes. Up until that point, they said they only ever had killed terrorists, they'd never killed civilians. And of course, it made front page news around the world. Colin rang me up, "Whatever happened to that film Eye in the Sky?" So I rang Guy. Oh, he said, "Oh, it's funny. You know, Liam Neeson's been on the phone this morning. He asking what's happening with it." I said, "Well, we want to take it over. We'll take over the rights, and I promise you I'll get it made." And he's like, "Okay." So we took over the rights to it. And I remember at the time, I wasn't in a relationship. My kids were growing up. And I just had a feeling that I needed to be in America to find a director to make it. So I literally, the following week, relocated to America for 3 months to find a director. At various meetings. And as soon as I met Gavin Hood, I knew he was the right guy to make the film. And again, I'd never made a film. It was just instinct about creative people and about other humans. And, you know, thank God it turned out to be a good instinct. And we made the film, and it did very well. It did very well.
Very good. Well, this is the part of the podcast where I ask my guest for their lockdown media, an album, a film, a box set, and a book. You've been the guy who's made the album, made the film, and you're moving into TV to do the box set. So you've got direct experience as a producer on those 3. And for all I know, you're making books as well. But it would be good to know which ones of those would get you through a lockdown, should you ever find yourself in such a thing.
Okay. The album that's got me through lockdown has been Anita Baker's Rapture, one of my favorite albums of all time. I always feel great when I hear it. It's a faultless record. Every song is faultless. The performances are faultless. And it just puts me in a wonderful mood. And for many of us out there who are just, you know, it's Groundhog Day, day after day after day, just put on a bit of Anita Baker in the morning and everything's wonderful. TV box set, it'd be a toss-up between The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. I was lucky enough to work with Aaron Paul on Eye in the Sky, of course, who played Jesse in Breaking Bad. So I've been revisiting Breaking Bad a lot recently. I don't think at a time when, of course, when Breaking Bad had first come out, I'd only just got into the business and I didn't really appreciate just how brilliant that is from a script point of view, from a performance point of view, directing. It's just incredible. And again, that and The Sopranos would be, there'd be a fight in our house or which one that would be. Having said that, I'm a little tired today because last night I sat up and binge watched It's a Sin, all 5 episodes, which if you haven't seen is absolutely brilliant. Russell T Davies' new show on Channel 4. It's all set in the 80s. It's all the music I know and all those kind of things. And from a film that I've watched in lockdown, which I've watched about 3, I'd seen it before, but I've watched it 3 times again in lockdown, is Contagion. And I tell all my mates who've not seen Contagion, they have to watch it because everything we're living through right now is exactly what happened in that film, which is scary because they made it 10 years ago. And a book, I found it very difficult to read during lockdown. I don't know why. I can just about manage the script. I've tried to read several books, but I just end up putting them down. I don't know if my brain just can't stay on it. The one book that's got me through is the Dalai Lama's book, The Art of Happiness, which is a small book. For those people who've never read it, I would highly recommend you do. And the Dalai Lama says, in order to be happy, you only have to do 2 things. 1, only do the things that make you happy. 2, don't do the things that don't make you happy. He said, but where people get confused is they mix pleasure with happiness, and they get confused. And often things we do for pleasure don't bring us happiness. So that's what I've been trying to do in my fuddled brain, lockdown brain, is try and stay happy and only do things that make me happy.
Well, thanks for coming on the pod. You've made me very happy, and I think you'll make all of my listeners very happy. It's very insightful, and good luck with all of the projects that are coming up in the future.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate it very much.